Hello, folks, and welcome to PINDROP World News. I'm AJ Camacho, and I'm joined as always by my brilliant co-producers Diego Austin.
Great to be here.
And Nick Castillo.
A pleasure as always.
So, as you probably know by now, we're not actually in the midst of producing a season, or we're getting ready for the next season, that is. And in the interim, we wanted to do a little chat with each other in person this time, actually, as well, rather than the typical remote, to talk about what we're kind of looking at in the news right now, directions that we see this next season going, and as well as just a reflection on some highlights from the last season of PINDROP. But we're going to start with the news as we're seeing it right now. I'm someone who likes to look relatively near term with this stuff, because I think when you start talking 5 years in the future, it's just too hard to predict. So Nick, tell us, what's like the number one news story that you're keeping an eye on over the next 3 months?
Sure. I think like most people in the world, the number one news story in my eyes and in my mind is going to be the Israel-Hamas war. Mm-hmm. That's obviously, every major news broadcast, first 10 minutes is always devoted to that. Most meaningful short-term developments is probably going to be the degree to which the international community begins starting to pressure Israel to commit to a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. Which we're already seeing a little bit of. As of recording this, there was a, isn't it that there's a pause of a few hours every day in fighting?
Yes, so the Israelis have agreed to 4-hour pauses on a daily basis in order for civilians to evacuate towards the south, which is obviously short of what most people in the international community who are interested in a ceasefire actually want. Mm-hmm. Even short of what Biden has been requesting, which is these humanitarian pauses, a day, a couple days to get an aid, to have some stability there. Most interestingly, we saw the French President Emmanuel Macron throw his weight fully behind a ceasefire, and I think you're going to see an increasing number of, especially European capitals, who, the Arab world has been calling for a ceasefire for days now because of the, really drastically high civilian death count. The continental Europeans may be moving in that direction as well. The big allies of Israel are the Anglophone countries, the United States and Britain in particular. So we'll see what happens there. But it's becoming increasingly clear, I think, that the Israelis are out of step with what their allies want. Biden wants a humanitarian pause. The Israelis have been very, very resistant to any of that. Biden and Blinken have been trying to get more aid in. The Israelis have been resistant to that as well, though they've allowed in some, 20 trucks a day is sort of what we've been hearing about. So I think the degree to which the international community and Israel's partners are going to begin more intensely pressuring them to commit to a humanitarian pause or something that, some might even call a ceasefire is going to be the major international aspect of the war over the next month or so. I mean, the civilian death toll has been really, really, horrific. The footage out of Gaza, gets worse by the day. Mm-hmm. You hear these horrific reports about the way hospitals are being forced to operate without anesthesia. Yeah. These really kind of really brutal realities of what's been, happening in Gaza over the last 10 days, over the last few weeks, and how it just seems to be getting worse and worse on a daily basis. We're going to have to see how the international community responds to that, and in particular, the countries that really hold sway in Jerusalem, which are the United States, and I suppose Great Britain to an extent.
And I do feel like this is the event, in one of those rare events in world news where the moment you hear it, this is shaking things up. Like the fact that Hamas had the capability to do this, you knew instantly that the ramifications would define the conflict for a long time to come, and it would be hugely important. I have been very surprised by the international response in how Israel has been as receptive as it has in a way, even though it's not meeting the demands. To me, that's a little bit surprising. What are your thoughts, Diego, on the future of this conflict in the coming months?
Well, what I'm looking at very intently is actually the Palestinian Authority, because I've been wondering for a long time how long they can survive, because they're very unpopular. Mahmoud Abbas is very old. This is something we've talked about a lot. Blinken just made a trip around the region. He met with Mahmoud Abbas, the most useful leader in the Middle East, and he said that something along the lines of seemed to hint yes, the Palestinian Authority will have a role in Gaza, and I'm like, what are you talking about, Anthony Blinken? The Palestinian Authority is useless and incompetent, and everybody hates them. They can't even control Nablus and Jenin. I went there there's no presence of any sort of state in Nablus and Jenin because everyone hates the Palestinian Authority, and there were just mass protests, pretty big protests. I guess saying mass protests is hard to define, but pretty big protests throughout the West Bank, including in Ramallah, There were reports of live ammunition being
Right.
fired, and recently this hasn't been picked up so much by the Western media, which I'm pretty disappointed about. But there was an assassination attempt on Mahmoud Abbas.
I actually wasn't even aware of this.
And it was by this obscure new group called Sons of Abu Jandal, which, I mean, I don't condone that. That's terrible, but that is a very good name. That's like
They might be
yeah.
doing terrible things, but they know how to pick a
that's
good
a
name.
very good name. But
gets-
the name is interesting though. Don't worry.
Okay.
I'll get in there. But so some people, I've seen some accounts saying, "Oh, it was Hamas." I was like, no. It's like arguably worse because Hamas
I'm sorry,
is like
worse than
Well,
Hamas.
not that they're worse than Hamas, but if it's Hamas, like okay, that's kind of like expected. It's like different factions fighting each other. No, it turns out these were defectors from the Palestinian Authority, from what I'm reading at least. It seems
Yeah.
like
Ooh.
they were like guys in the security apparatus who defected and tried to assassinate. So that points to a deeper issue of you got
And
a
that's
rift.
more coup-like at that
If
point,
these exactly
too.
if these reports are true, that it was guys in the PA, then that I think is even worse than it being Hamas because it points to like you have a rift within the PA that's gotten to the point where someone tried to assassinate Mahmoud Abbas, and we go back to the name of who was Abu Jandal. That was like the sort of nickname of a guy who during Operation Defensive Shield in 2002 in Jenin sort of defected from the PA and became like the main leader of I guess what they would call like resistance in Jenin against like the Israeli operation. So it points to a sentiment in the PA that there's some people there who feel that this sort of complacency with what's happening in Gaza and generally just collaboration with Israel is not the way to go down anymore, and they want to like deviate from that. In Sons of Abu Jandal, they issued an ultimatum to Abu Mazen, and they pretty much said that he needs to take a more active role with what's happening in Gaza, which is vague, but they could be suggesting that he needs to like part with Israel and maybe take up arms or something, or at least just be like way more aggressive than he is. Which I mean, I do not think that Mahmoud Abbas is capable of changing his strategy like at all, because that's like what he's shown, and he's like 87 years old and like very old and just not energetic. So
I think more than that though, Abu Mazen's always constrained because the PA is super reliant on foreign
That is
allies
true.
and
Yeah,
foreign donors.
They wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the
Yeah.
international community recognizing
So
them.
Abu Mazen can't call for like armed resistance against the state of Israel, which is what it seems like, especially these guys are asking of him, right?
Right.
Sort of a return to Intifada style warfare between Fatah blocks and the IDF, which Abu Mazen's not going to call for.
Yeah, I will say Abu Mazen is put in a very difficult position. It's very hard to be the Palestinian Authority, I think, but also like, man, I've seen other guys in the Palestinian Authority make maybe more energetic speeches.
Well, he's 87.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like
there are guys within the Palestinian Authority
But
who
he-
like make better, who are younger, who are more energetic, who speak good English.
Yeah.
Guys who could maybe make a better case to the international
Exactly.
community. The foreign minister, whose name I'm
Yeah.
blanking on.
I know you're
You can maybe
talking
add that
about.
in post.
Yeah, because he wrote a good piece in The Economist, for
He
example.
was
that
on the
well
PBS
received.
NewsHour yesterday. Like this
Oh,
is a
was
guy.
he?
He's younger. He's energetic. He can make a good
Yeah.
case.
He
to-
probably has more
issue
charisma
though,
than Mahmoud
the
Abbas.
issue is how you're gonna make that transition of leadership, because
Yeah.
if they hold elections, Hamas is probably gonna win. The one guy who might be able to compete with Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, in an election in the West Bank, or just across like the Palestinian territories, is Marwan Barghouti. He was, it's complicated though, because he was the leader of the Second Intifada. I believe he led Tanzim, which like is a faction of Fatah that was more, I guess, aggressive during the Second Intifada. He's in prison for the rest of his life. I mean, I don't know if even if he were to win an election, it's like he's running things from prison, unless Israel decides that.
But would Israel allow him to run?
Well, if they think it's so urgent, as in like Mahmoud Abbas is gonna die, and it's either this guy or Hamas,
Yeah.
then maybe.
But it would have to be a desperate
with-
situation like that.
Yeah, it really, I think a lot of the direction that this conflict is going to go in is going to depend on who wins the blame game after the Gaza war, because if the wrong people win the blame game after the Gaza war, they could be like, well, we're just going to do away with this whole thing. But I from what I'm seeing, I do think Bibi's catching a lot of flack. I do think the far right guys are catching a lot of flack. So
So I think we could talk a bit about Israeli domestic poll and where that's going to go, because that's obviously very important. A lot of the polling and a lot of the conversations I'm seeing on this issue is framing Benny Gantz, the leader of the opposition Blue and White Party, as the next. He's, the polling indicates that he's the most popular figure. He's in the war cabinet at the moment, making high-level decisions. Right. He's had strong challenges to Netanyahu before in recent elections. Gantz is also popular at the moment because he's a former IDF head. He was the chair of the chief council of the IDF or whatever you call it. So he can pitch himself as a military guy, which there's a strong record of Israeli politicians being able to pitch themselves as strong military guys. This was like Ariel Sharon. And
I was going to say Sharon. That was the whole reason he succeeded in getting back into power.
The issue with Gantz, though, I think, is that he's super status quo. Like, yes, Netanyahu is a right winger. He's not a status quo guy necessarily in some ways because he's talked very openly about a desire to annex parts of the West Bank. Mm-hmm. He's very pro-settler and brings these right-wing guys into coalition with him. So he's not really totally a status quo guy. Gantz is totally a status quo guy in my view. And the problem with that is that the status quo isn't sustainable, right?
Yeah. Right. And by status quo, I mean the cutting the grass strategy.
Yeah, like the mowing the grass where every few years you go in and kill as many terrorists as possible to keep it under control. Mm-hmm. Settlements, you're not going to do anything about that. The occupation remains a brutal reality of daily life in the West Bank. Who knows what they're going to do with Gaza in the years to come. Netanyahu's talking about an indefinite occupation, more or less, of Gaza by the IDF, which is a terrible idea, in my view. So I guess the future of Gaza is sort of a wrinkle in that status quo idea, because what does it mean to have a status quo with Gaza again? Mm-hmm. I guess it means an occupation that looks like what's going on in the West Bank, but that's a whole can of worms.
Absolutely.
So it's hard to even make predictions about that.
Right. Look, we've had a really good talk about Israel, domestic politics, and the region more broadly, but I want to give us two more issues looking forward that come to my mind, and they're both elections. So most urgently is the Argentine elections, and it's so recent I won't talk about it too much other than we have Javier Milei, also known as the chainsaw guy, who is proposing these really libertarian economic policy ideas, and then we have I regrettably forget the name of his challenger at the moment, but more in line with the government that we see at the moment, more typical of Argentinian economics, of not being fully libertarian, having a little bit more government intervention.
Yeah, the other guy is a remnant from the Peron.
Yeah, he's a Peronista and all that.
Yeah.
But the impact for this country could be huge. It looks right now like Milei is going to have a difficult time, but it's not impossible. And particularly if Milei won, Argentina is the economy that for 100 years has every ingredient for an immense success and yet consistently stumbles. And not that I'm generally a libertarian in terms of economics myself, but it would have the potential to shake things up one way or another. And that could be a really big deal for Argentina, for better or worse, that type of change of leadership. Equally, keeping with the Peronista, maybe eventually something will turn around. It's going to have huge ramifications for this country, though.
Is Milei pro-BRICS or anti-BRICS?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure what his position on BRICS is. I'm sure we can look this up.
Because I know that Argentina, I believe, was one of the countries that was proposed to enter.
Yeah, and I think officially they will be in January, unless something changes.
I think, if I don't remember, we'll just check. Yeah, I don't want to make any statements, I guess, but. Yeah.
And while we check for that, I'll also add, I think, the Taiwan elections.
Oh, so Milei has indicated he would be interested in a withdrawal from approved application of BRICS membership.
That's what I thought, yeah.
That's another big deal.
Look, man, as an American, I'm just look, man, I'm kind of looking at these Argentine elections. I'm like, man, it's gonna be good for
Well, he wants to dollarize, right?
He does.
He wants to dollarize, which is great for U.S. currency, in all honesty.
Yes, and it could also have the impact. In fact, I was in Argentina less than a year ago. Yeah, it's a good time to be an American, bring American cash into Argentina.
Well, it's usually a good time to bring American cash into Argentina. This is sort of the issue, right?
Right. I'm generally of the philosophy that libertarian economics, of the degree that Milei is arguing for, I'm generally of the philosophy that's not a good thing. Equally, what has been happening so far has clearly not been working. So there is that bit of me that's like, even if it seems like a bad change, it is a change. And I can understand why Argentinians would have a similar
So
philosophy.
I am not a Latin America guy, nor am I an economics guy, so I should probably preface everything I'm going to say with that. But the general story you hear about Argentina is that the Peronistas have more or less run the country into the ground for the past century. Like really outrageous levels of spending for an economy of its size, bailouts every like 5 years from the IMF, like tons of corruption going on with the Kirchnerists also.
Corruption is a big factor.
So if I was an Argentine, I don't know why I would elect a Peronists when the Peronists have been running the country for more or less the past 75 years, and what was once seen as one of like the great future economies of the world in the mid 20th century has really been just a chaotic mess, especially when they look across the border to Chile, which has been a pretty successful country economically.
Yes. And I think a lot of people would argue, whether it's Milton Friedman or whether it's Chile, middle class and above Chileans themselves, that the reason they were successful is because Pinochet put in a relatively libertarian economic model.
Well, that and copper prices.
Copper prices certainly helped as well. And you can make these arguments about what was the reason for succeeding, but at least if you ask Milton Friedman, who didn't advise Pinochet, but did actually have chats with him and supposedly inspired the junta's economic policy, Friedman would argue Pinochet did a bad decision as a dictator because by liberalizing the economy in the way that he did, that's not very conducive to a dictatorship because it promotes a better, more prosperous economy. When people are more prosperous in the economy, they want to have things like democracy.
Modernization.
That's Friedman's argument. Modernization, economic modernization.
It's funny you say that. I often think that right-wing dictatorships end up being less long-lasting than left-wing dictatorships. If you think about the countries that we talk about as making these like really productive, like sort of slow-running transitions to democracy, they are, and I'm thinking in particular about Chile, but also about Taiwan and South Korea. They were right-wing dictatorships, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to left-wing dictatorships that usually build like this mass party apparatus that allows the regime to be really, really solidly in control of the regime.
And I think that's the best argument for why, and this is getting slightly tangential, but it's a nice segue, and I think that's really why China hasn't democratized, or at least that's the best argument I've heard for why it hasn't. Economically, it looks very good, but because it's left-wing, the money is largely controlled by the party. And so if you're the middle class, you might want democracy, but you don't want to bite the hand that feeds because you would tie your success to the party. And I'm going to use this as a segue to get into the other honorable mention I wanted to mention, which is the Taiwan elections. Because these are coming up. As China, the PRC, is amping up its pressure on Taiwan and threats to invade, you have the incumbent party, which is generally more pro-independence, and you have the challengers, the Kuomintang, who are the historically in charge party of Taiwan, who founded the country as something separate from the PRC, who are more in favor of unification. And the general narrative is that if the incumbents remain, China will have an increased incentive to try to invade because they do not want Taiwan to declare independence. And they're not even happy very much with the current status quo of de facto independence. I don't know what your all thoughts are on this, but China's always a big hot button issue.
That is definitely something to look at now. Of course, something that people have been talking about is, it started with the war in Ukraine, where people were saying, well, now that everyone's kind of distracted with the war in Ukraine, it might be kind of a good time for China to do something. And now with the war in Gaza opening another front, that is definitely increasingly relevant. I'm not an expert on Taiwanese politics, but from what you're describing, it does sound like this election is going to be very important. Yeah.
I'll say, though, there's obvious reason for concern around Chinese aggression against Taiwan. I still, generally speaking, fall on the side of I don't think they would be willing to do it. I think that all the disincentives for an invasion of Taiwan remain, regardless of whether or not the U.S. is distracted in Ukraine or Gaza. There are huge economic incentives around not invading Taiwan for the foreseeable future, in part because the backlash from the industrialized Western world would be so intense. Like we've seen this wholesale decoupling of Western economies from Russia. I don't think something that dramatic would be possible with China because China is so crucial for Western economies, but possibly something similar.
But the reliance on China is slowly declining. So the longer time goes, the more possible fuller scale decoupling is.
True. But again, like for the near future, I don't think whether or not China will invade Taiwan is going to hinge on these elections, is maybe the way I should phrase it.
Yeah.
Because I think fundamentally, also I think, again, this could change based on the results of our elections that are coming up, and I think we should probably talk about what we've been seeing in terms of U.S. domestic politics vis-a-vis foreign relations. But especially if the Democrats hang on to the White House for the next 4 years, the Biden admin showed itself to be incredibly committed to the transatlantic alliance and what the transatlantic alliance could do to contain aggression from, what people in the West might see as like black knight states, like sort of rogue actors from the Western view. So I think that most of the disincentives to invade Taiwan remain. I mean, I'm not an expert on Taiwan issues. We should probably get somebody on the show at some point who is.
Like Patrick Coe.
Like our personal friend Patrick Coe, who is an opinionated friend of ours.
Yeah. He's Brazilian, but Taiwanese in terms of his family heritage.
I think he's there at the moment as well, actually.
I think he is in Taiwan, you're right.
Yeah.
I'll add one thing before we talk about U.S. domestic politics, because being the closest thing to the world superpower, that's an important factor here in global events. But the only thing I'll add for Taiwan is I agree with you in that when you think about it rationally, if you think about it from a realist international affairs perspective, China just should not invade Taiwan. There's very little incentive. But consistently, from meetings between Nixon and Maoist officials to meetings between Carter and Deng Xiaoping officials, something very consistent that Chinese officials have sort of told American officials privately when there have been these questions asked about what the other side doesn't understand is they said, the Americans don't appreciate how much we care about Taiwan, how serious we are about Taiwan, how on an ideological level we are very passionate about seeing that island become part of the mainland. Maybe that's changed more recently because we don't hear as much about how Xi Jinping and his officials think, but that's always been front of mind for them. Let's talk about domestic politics, though. We are recording this actually just a couple of days after the third GOP debate, and I would argue relative to the previous ones, foreign policy took the center stage. Frankly, at a greater level, I think, than we've seen in any presidential debate that I have in my memory, which granted only goes back to probably 2016. But what do you all make of this? Because we do see this huge rift in the Republican Party in that we have folks like Nikki Haley, who are very hawkish, Mike Pence as well prior to dropping out, who toe a line that is relatively similar to the Biden line. And then you have folks like Vivek Ramaswamy, and increasingly Donald Trump, at least in his rhetoric, that is a little bit less pro-supporting Ukraine. DeSantis is really, I think, epitomizes the middle between Haley and Ramaswamy, or Haley and Trump.
I mean, DeSantis went on record calling the Ukraine war a territorial squabble.
He did.
Or turf war, I think was the phrase, between like two nations far away from the United States or something to that effect.
Well, yeah, I do see this increasing trend in Republican politics since since the party started changing during Trump. It became like increasingly common, like an isolationist trend.
Yeah.
Which honestly just like pisses me off whenever I see it, because I feel like people, they'll say stuff like that, like, oh, this is just a turf war far away from us. I'm like, this is like important.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is impacting like the oil economy, this is impacting like the grain economy.
The entire...
And it's also just about like geostrategic interests. It's like, well, if you just let Russia...
It's also, are you interested in like Europe being like a politically and economically functional place? Because if you're interested in like Europe being a functional continent, you kind of have to want the Russians not to win.
There's there's just this like sense that really annoys me, because I even feel a lot of times I'm like, Ron DeSantis, you're a smart guy, you know this isn't a turf war between, like, I know you probably don't think like that. I think it's like rhetoric to appeal.
This is our
to
resident Floridian speaking.
I hate Ron DeSantis. It's like this rhetoric to appeal to this audience that I just don't think knows what they're talking about when it comes to like foreign affairs. I don't want to sound like arrogant, but it's like a sentiment I've heard a lot from like maybe even people I've like known in the past, where like in my home states, or just some people where they have the sense that these wars far away just don't matter for America, which, and I understand where the sentiment comes from, because our nation did get sucked into like the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, and in some cases, like in the case of Afghanistan especially, didn't really accomplish much. So I understand where the sentiment comes from, but the sense that every time there's a war abroad, it just isn't something that's going to impact us, I think is just very ignorant.
And I think there is a messaging thing here in terms of the Biden administration's message has generally been one of, by supporting Ukraine, we're wearing down Russia. Russia is an adversary. This keeps us safer.
He also makes a values-based
and
argument
there is
as well.
absolutely values-based
Huge
one,
values
which is
rhetoric.
Ukraine, for all that its democracy is far from perfect,
Yeah.
and often classified, I think, fairly as a hybrid regime. It still has a broad value to democracy that current Russian society, or at least Vladimir Putin, certainly does not. But I would add that I think President Zelensky articulated a message that is much more powerful, which is the articulation that why send American money? Because if we don't send American aid, if we don't send American money, if we don't send American arms to Ukraine now, and Ukraine loses, there's a decent chance, a non-zero chance, that in 10, 20, 30 years, it's going to be a NATO member country that's attacked. And American boots, children, grandchildren will be the ones
I mean,
fighting.
it's not just that, though. I think when we conceptualize what the disappearance of American assistance to Ukraine would mean, we have to think about what the goals of the Putin regime are. I don't think anyone should be convinced that the goal of the Kremlin is no longer the full decapitation of an independent Ukraine.
I don't think they'd be fighting like they are if that wasn't still their
The
intention.
rhetoric has changed because Putin now believes it's no longer possible for him to take over all of Ukraine because the West has backed the Ukrainians so much. But if we conceive of what the total disappearance of Western security assistance would mean for the Ukrainians, there's a good chance it would mean another complete Russian drive to Kiev, which would entail the creation of sort of a failed state of 40 million people in Europe. Which is like, if you're talking about refugees, if you're talking about the economic ramifications, if you're talking about the security implications for places like Moldova and Poland and the Baltics, that's a huge deal. I mean, I also the ambitions of the regime keep expanding in other ways as well. This is something we were just talking about earlier today. And as somewhat of like a Eurasia watcher myself, you're seeing increased attention to what Putin sort of terms the Union State, which in theory for now is only between Belarus and Russia.
Right.
But I think in the near future could very, very easily come to encapsulate some kind of mass civilizational state comprised of Russia, Belarus, occupied Ukrainian territory, and sort of these odd breakaway states from Georgia that we sometimes touch upon.
Yeah.
So I think there would be huge implications for the entire Eurasian and European space if you can have if Western support for the Ukrainians disappears. Which, by the way, I'll make this point as well. I think that's a different question than the question of when do the Ukrainians sort of say we're not taking back all of our territory. There needs to be negotiations.
Right.
You can have a perfectly reasonable conversation about that. The conversation over when should we try to pursue a ceasefire with the Russians is a different conversation than what's going on in the GOP, which the conversation there is this war doesn't matter. Ukraine is either a deeply corrupt regime not worth defending, or in some cases you even get rhetoric about how Ukraine isn't much of a real state. Like you do see that bubbling up in the sort of national conservative discourse. Ramaswamy, who's sort of my read of Ramaswamy is that he encapsulates like an ideologically committed national conservative right-wing vision. Like I think DeSantis, there's a very good argument to be made. He doesn't actually believe in any of this. He's just an opportunist.
Yeah.
Ramaswamy, I think, is a true believer. And when Ramaswamy gets on a stage, he doesn't say, "Oh, we have to admit that there is a stalemate in Ukraine. We should support our allies, but try to get them to come to the negotiating table." He says things like there is a Nazi regime in Kiev. He says things about the fact that, these regions haven't even been part of Ukraine since 2014. Why should we care about them? There are Russian speakers there. Russia has a legitimate interest in these regions.
Right.
These things that align much more so with the actual narrative coming out of the Kremlin.
Right, which I was going to say. Ramaswamy doesn't say that he wants Russia to win. He says that he doesn't like Russia, but a lot of his talking points for why not to back Ukraine are Russia's talking points.
Ramaswamy has also said in the past that he wants to pursue détente with the Russians to try to split them off from the Chinese because he views China as the actual enemy. There's no reason we should pursue détente with Russia. It's a rogue expansionary state with a massive nuclear arsenal and the ability to destroy world oil markets. There should be no détente with Russia.
I would argue, I would argue that there could be an avenue for pursuing détente with China. Russia's the one I cannot see it with.
I think the Biden administration has actually done a pretty good job of making sure we don't fall into a Cold War trap with the Chinese. He's sent Blinken and Janet Yellen has made a series of statements to this effect. Yes,
they're going to meet in San Francisco coming soon. Joe Biden and Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and I mean
2 weeks from now, I think.
Biden has sort of drawn red lines around chips and Taiwan and these good things that I support. But he's also, I think he has been careful not to fall into like sort of the trap of a new Cold War with China, which I don't think we should pursue.
Diego, any thoughts? We've been hogging this side of the table for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess now that we're getting back to, I guess, American politics, I mean, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Vivek Ramaswamy is kind of a psychopath. And maybe a Manchurian candidate. Yeah,
Good
I mean,
movie, by the
but
way.
I guess my sort of thoughts on the primaries. To be honest, I haven't been paying as much attention to the primaries just because I very highly doubt that any of these people are going to be able to like beat Donald Trump anyways.
Yeah.
So the way I see it is I'm kind of like I don't really think any of this stuff matters because I feel like these guys at best are just going to be like a vice president. But
Ramaswamy, though, might be a vice president.
yeah, which I mean would be scary, but I still just feel like Trump's views are gonna take precedence at the end of the day. Although what I will say is we still there's still an air of uncertainty because I think if there was an election now, Trump would like win the Republican primary. But with all
There's
the
a lot
court
of time to go,
cases, with
too.
all the court cases he's up against, you never know if something's gonna happen where. Maybe he gets found guilty of something and he gets sent to prison or like something happens.
Or he's healthy even. He's an old guy.
He has like a heart attack or something. Like he's a pretty old guy. And then if that happens, and I mean,
And heck, there's even, and I know this is always floated and it doesn't go anywhere, but every time there's a convention with a controversial candidate seeming to win, there's always that talk. And what if Trump hypothetically was already sentenced to prison when the convention happens? Is there going to be a rebellion from the GOP leadership that says we cannot nominate someone who is a convicted
I mean,
criminal?
I think if that happens, the whole party collapses because that's where the base is. The base likes the fact that he's
This
under
is just
indictment.
it.
You
The
know?
Republican establishment does not like Trump, but they can't abandon him. I mean, this is not new information.
So, I mean, I want to put some numbers behind what we're saying, just sort of back up what Diego and AJ are talking about. Most recent Iowa polling data, Trump at 45%, and that's with all the court cases, you know. Ramaswamy comes in at 5%. I guarantee you Ramaswamy's backup voters are not voting for Nikki Haley. DeSantis at 17%. And again, like, my perception would be, I bet the number 2 choice for most DeSantis people isn't Nikki Haley. I would guess it's Trump.
Yeah.
And then Haley, who's like the big hope of like the more traditional wing of the Republican Party, only 13.9%.
Haley is the person, and this is as someone who does not like a lot of what she has to say. She's the single GOP candidate who I think I would have a decent chance of voting for in a general election. I don't know that I would. But she's the one who I actually look at it and be like, I could see myself voting.
I like watching her bully Vivek Ramaswamy because Vivek Ramaswamy is an infuriating person, and I like when Nikki Haley called him scum on a GOP stage because he attacked her daughter.
I also loved her comeback about the 5-inch heels.
Yeah, because what was
so
Ramaswamy
cute.
thinking? Who's like giving this guy these lines? He's like, oh, you know what's a good idea? Make fun of a woman for wearing heels. Are you crazy? Like, who's running this guy's campaign?
Hey, credit to Nikki Haley. She had a quick comeback. I don't know if she rehearsed it, but goddamn.
I'll say on a personal level, I have been continually surprised by how good she is on a debate stage because
She is.
you might have been there also, AJ, but when I was a freshman in college, I saw her speak when she came to GW, and I was like,
did not, actually.
I was really unimpressed. I was like, this lady is giving off some line about how she doesn't even have an ideology. I don't buy any of that. But she's great on the debate stage. That's what keeps her campaign going because I think what's happening is that even though she's not polling all that great, the donors who are scared of another Trump presidency or, God forbid, a Ramaswamy presidency, they see her on a debate stage and they throw money her way.
Yeah, no, I think so. All right, we've had a really great talk about all of these issues that are coming up in the coming months. I think that's great stuff for folks to take away and folks to consider, and possibly stuff that could be the center of future PINDROP episodes. Speaking of future PINDROP episodes, let's talk a little bit about what we're getting into this season, and then we'll also do a little bit of gentle reflection about the past season.